The wind in Coyote Ford didn't blow, it scoured. It came off the high mesas of the New Mexico territory with a high, thin keen, carving the red earth into gullies and blasting the alkali dust into formations that looked like battlefield smoke. It was the autumn of 1889, and the land was thirsty, waiting for a winter that promised only hardness. Sable Hart felt the grit of it in her teeth, between her fingers, and deep in her lungs. She sat hunched on the hard plank of a hired freight wagon, her body aching from a week of relentless jarring. She was 24, but the last 5 years had etched lines of caution around her eyes that belonged to a woman twice her age. She clutched a small canvas satchel on her lap, as if it were a shield. Tucked inside, wrapped in her only spare kerchief, was the letter. The paper was creased and softened by 100 readings, the ink slightly blurred from the damp of her own anxious hands. Honest kitchen work, the advertisement had read, tacked to the wall of the stagecoach office back in Kansas. Maddox Ridge, it said, board provided. Honest work. The words had felt like a prayer. They were her entire future, purchased with the last of her wages saved from the Trailside Inn. She instinctively touched the inside of her left wrist, her sleeve sliding up to reveal a pale, thin scar, shaped like a loop. It was an old mark, one of many, reminders of a life defined by the hot-tempered demands of others, of heavy trays, rough hands, and the sharp, stinging judgment for a broken dish or a slow reply. The hem of her gray wool dress was stained with the dried mud of a dozen different wagon stops, a map of her desperate journey south. The teamster, a man named Silas, whose beard was stained brown with tobacco juice, finally hauled back on the reins. The 6-mule team grunted, their harnesses jangling in the sudden, oppressive quiet. "This is it, ma'am," he grumbled, not looking at her. "Coyote Ford, Maddox Ridge." Sable peered out from under the wagon's canvas cover. The ridge was barely a rise in the unrelenting flatness. The ranch was a collection of buildings that seemed to be losing a long war with gravity and the wind. The main house was unpainted clapboard, weathered to the color of old bone. The fence line bordering the track was a row of leaning, silvered posts, patched in places with rusted baling wire. The barn roof had a distinct sag in the middle, like a tired old horse's back. The only sign of life was a thin gray ribbon of smoke pulled straight from a stone chimney, instantly shredded by the wind. Silas spat a dark stream into the dust. "Place ain't for dreamers." He swung down from his seat, his boots hitting the ground with a thud. He went to the back of the wagon and unceremoniously yanked her satchel. The worn leather strap broke. The bag hit the red dirt and burst open, spilling its meager contents: a wooden comb, a bar of lye soap, a spare ribbon, and the precious, folded letter. Sable scrambled down, her legs numb and stiff, nearly falling as her worn shoes met the unstable ground. Her face burned with humiliation as she knelt to gather her things. "That'll be the balance," Silas said, unmoved. Her hands shook as she retrieved the last of her coins from a small drawstring pouch, counting them into his grimy, outstretched palm. He didn't thank her. He just grunted, climbed back onto his seat, and cracked his whip. "Get up, you devils!" The wagon lurched away, leaving her standing alone in a cloud of stinging dust, clutching her broken bag. She was stranded. There was no town in sight, no other ranch, just the silent, waiting prairie and the worn-out farmstead before her. She took a breath, tasting only grit, and forced her shoulders back. She had come this far. She would see it through. She picked up the satchel and walked toward the house, her heart a cold, tight knot under her ribs. Before she reached the sagging porch, the door creaked open. He filled the doorway. That was her first thought. He was tall, broader than the frame seemed to allow, with shoulders that spoke of lifting, hauling, and enduring. His hair was dark, damp with sweat at the temples, and fell over his forehead. He wore a rough canvas shirt, The sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and dusted with what might have been flour, or maybe feed. A worn leather belt cinched his trousers, and hanging from it was not a pistol, but a large skinning knife in a sheath worn smooth by 1,000 uses. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a deep, sober gray, the color of the sky just before the storm. They weren't angry or surprised or welcoming. They were just observant. They took in her stained dress, her wind-whipped hair, her broken satchel, and the red dust that covered her from head to toe. He looked past her, at the disappearing wagon. Then his gaze settled back on her face. He said nothing. The silence stretched, pulled thin by the wind. Sable's courage, so carefully hoarded, began to fray.
Mr. Maddox!
Her voice was a reedy thing, instantly snatched away by the breeze. She had to clear her throat and try again, stepping closer. Mr. Cole Maddox. He gave a single curt nod. She fumbled in her satchel for the letter, holding it out. The wind tried to rip it from her fingers. I'm Sable Hart. I'm here. About the position. The advertisement for kitchen work. He didn't take the letter. His gaze dropped to the paper, his eyes narrowing. She could see him read the words upside down. A deep line appeared between his brows. Not of anger, but of a slow, weary calculation. He looked back up at her face, his expression unreadable. "I didn't write this," he said. The words were flat, devoid of malice, but absolute. They struck Sable with the force of a physical blow. "What? But it says Maddox Ridge. It came from the post office in Mesita Bluff." She unfolded it, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it steady. "It says—" "I know what it says, Miss." His voice was low, rough like burlap. "I saw the tack on the board myself. 2 weeks back, I told the postmaster to take it down. It's a fake." "A fake," she whispered. The blood drained from her face, leaving her cold, so cold. The entire world seemed to tilt. The journey, the money, the last fragile tendril of hope. All of it for nothing. "I'm not hiring," he stated, as if that settled it. And then, another sound cut through the wind. Laughter. It was cruel and high-pitched, coming from a low ridge of sandstone and juniper about 200 yards to the north. 3 men sat on fine-looking horses, watching the scene. They were dressed well, in clean dusters and new hats, a stark contrast to the worn-out ranch and the man standing in the doorway. "Well, looky there, Jeb," one of them shouted, his voice carrying with perfect, mocking clarity. "Looks like Cole's mail-order help finally showed up." Another one, wiry and mean-looking, tipped his hat back. "She looks sturdy enough to handle your kitchen. Maddox, or you gonna send her back?" The third, a barrel-chested man who sat his horse like he owned the land it stood on, just laughed, a deep, booming sound that made Sable flinch. "That's what you get for thinking you own the water at Dry Willow, Maddox. Maybe she can help you dig a new well." The Lathrop sons, bankers, landowners, and, clearly, the authors of her humiliation. Sable felt a sickness rise in her throat. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a prank, a cruel, targeted joke played on a desperate man. And she was the punchline, delivered neatly to his door. The shame was a physical weight, pressing the air from her lungs. She couldn't look at Maddox. She couldn't look at the men on the ridge. She just broke. Not with tears. Tears were a luxury she hadn't afforded in years. It was an internal collapse, a folding in of her spirit. She lowered the hand holding the letter. She turned her back on Cole Maddox, on the house, and faced the empty, endless plain. The wind hit her full on, whipping her hair across her face, stinging her eyes. She had nowhere to go. The wagon was gone. The nearest town was Mesita Bluff, a full day's walk, and she wouldn't last half of it without water. The men on the ridge were still laughing. The sky, which had been a flat, metallic gray, was darkening to the color of a fresh bruise in the west. The wind shifted, died for a second, and then returned with a new, cold bite, carrying the unmistakable scent of ozone and wet dust. Rain. A hard, cold autumn rain was moments away. Sable wrapped her arms around herself, her shoulders hitching with a single, dry sob of utter desolation. Behind her, she heard a sound, a scrape of a boot, a metallic clink. She tensed, expecting the door to close, leaving her to the elements and the mockery of the lathrops. Instead, something heavy and warm landed on her shoulders. She gasped, startled. It was a coat, a heavy canvas duckcloth coat, lined with wool, smelling faintly of wood smoke, leather, and the man himself. It was huge on her, the weight of it a sudden, shocking comfort, a bulwark against the wind. She turned. Cole Maddox stood on the porch, his hand still in the air from the practiced motion of throwing it. He wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed on the ridge, his jaw set, his gray eyes now as hard and cold as iron. The Lathrop's laughter faltered under that silent, unmoving stare. He brought his eyes back to her. He looked at the thin, shivering frame lost inside his massive coat, and then at the darkening sky. He jerked his chin toward the open, dark doorway behind him. "Storm's coming in," he said, his voice rougher than before. "Get inside." It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't an offer of a job or a promise of kindness. It was an order, blunt and to the point, but it was also a shield. Sable hesitated, caught between the humiliation of the prank and the immediate threat of the storm. The Lathrop brothers, seeming to find the new development less amusing, let out a final whoop and spurred their horses, disappearing back over the gully, as if their departure were a signal. The first drop of rain, cold and as large as a coin, struck Sable's cheek. It was the final punctuation. She looked at the dark, open door. She looked at the vast, hostile plains, now being swallowed by a sheet of gray rain. She pulled the heavy coat tighter, the residual warmth from his body seeping into her skin, and she walked. She stepped past him, over the worn threshold, and into the dim, warm shadows of the house. The door closed behind her, shutting out the howl of the wind. A second later, the sky opened. The first volley of rain hit the corrugated tin roof of the porch, a sudden, violent drumming that sounded like 1,000 charging horses, sealing the most temporary of truces. It was a decision made of pure necessity, but it felt like a thin, trembling thread of fate being pulled taut. The kitchen was a cave of shadows, dominated by the massive, cold hearth and the howl of the storm outside. Sable stood dripping just inside the door, the heavy coat pooling at her feet, the abrupt warmth, thick with the scent of old smoke, dust, and something vaguely animal, was almost suffocating after the sharp, clean bite of the rain. Cole Maddox moved past her without a word, his boots leaving damp prints on the wide plank floor. He didn't light a lamp. He walked to the hearth and gestured at the neatly stacked kindling in a wooden box beside it. "We'll need the fire." It was a command born of necessity, but for Sable, it was a lifeline. Work. She understood. Orders. She knew how to follow. She shed the heavy coat, hanging it on a peg by the door where it dripped in a steady, rhythmic patter. She pushed her damp, stringy hair back from her face and knelt at the hearth. Her hands were red and raw. The knuckles split from the dry cold of her journey, but they were capable. The men at the Trailside Inn had always mocked her slow reading, but they never mocked her hands. They knew how to work. With practiced, efficient movements, she laid the tinder-dried grass and wood shavings and built a small cage of kindling over it. She found the flint and steel on the mantel, and with a few sharp downward strikes, a spark caught. She blew on it gently, not with panic, but with patience. The tiny ember glowed, caught the edge of a shaving, and then, with a soft whoosh, a small, hungry flame licked up. She added larger pieces, building the fire with an architect's care until it was a steady, crackling blaze, pushing back the oppressive cold and filling the room with a flickering, golden light. Only then did she stand and take stock of her surroundings. It was a man's room, built for utility, not comfort. Iron pots hung from ceiling hooks. Sacks slumped against one wallflower, beans, coffee. A dry sink held a single tin plate and mug. It was clean, but the cleanliness of solitude, of function. The firelight revealed a pot half filled with water and soaked beans. A task started and abandoned. Sable felt the old, familiar pull of duty. She washed her hands at the pump by the sink, the water icy cold, and set to work. She added more water, found a hunk of salt pork hanging in the larder, and sliced it into the pot. She mixed a batch of cornmeal for Johnny cakes, her movements economical and sure. Soon, the simple, hearty smells of simmering beans and baking corn began to infuse the air, chasing away the scent of dust and solitude, making the small fortress feel, for the first time, like a home. As the rain-soaked twilight deepened, the room grew dark beyond the immediate circle of the fire. Sable looked for a lamp. She found one on the main table, a simple coal oil lamp with a clean chimney. She lit a splinter from the fire and touched it to the wick. As the light swelled, it illuminated the far corners of the room, and it illuminated the shelf. It was just a simple piece of wood, high on the wall over a small, unused writing desk. It wasn't a formal mantel, but it was clearly a place of reverence. On it sat 2 items: a dried, brittle sprig of rosemary, and a thin, tarnished silver ring, chased with a pattern of vines. Sable's hand, holding the lamp, froze. It was a woman's ring, a wedding band. The realization settled on her with a quiet, profound weight. The empty house, the clumsy mending she'd glimpsed on his shirt cuff, the hard, sober set of his eyes, they weren't just the hallmarks of a lonely bachelor. This was a house of grief. The prank the Lathrop boys had played wasn't just cruel. It was a desecration. She felt a flush of anger on Cole's behalf, hot and sharp, quickly followed by the familiar, cold caution. This was a place of deep wounds, and she was an intruder. The back door opened with a gust of wet wind, making the new lamp flame gutter wildly. Cole entered, stamping the mud from his boots. He was carrying an armload of split juniper and oak, which he dropped with a rattling crash into the wood box. He shook the rain from his hat and hung it on a peg next to her own meager bonnet. He saw her standing by the desk, the lamp in her hand, the light falling on the shelf. His entire body went still. His gaze flicked from her to the ring and back, his face already grim, darkened. For a long second, Sable thought he would order her out, back into the storm. His silence was a wall of granite. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. The air was thick with the name of a ghost. Sable, in a gesture of pure, unconscious diplomacy, broke the stare. She turned, carried the lamp to the center of the main table, and set it down. She returned to the hearth, her back to him, and began to stir the beans, the rhythmic scrape of the wooden spoon against the iron pot the only sound. He stood there for another minute, water dripping from his slicker. Finally, the tension broke. He moved to the sink, washed his face and hands in the basin, and sat down at the head of the table. Sable filled a tin bowl with a thick, steaming soup of beans and salt pork. She placed a hot, crisp-edged Johnny cake on a plate beside it. She set them in front of him. He looked down at the food. It was the first hot meal he hadn't made for himself in... he couldn't remember how long. He picked up the spoon, then looked at her. His eyes were still guarded, still hard, but the immediate anger had been banked. He gave a single, curt nod. It was thanks, acknowledgement, and dismissal, all in one. Sable prepared her own, smaller plate and sat at the far end of the table. They ate in silence. The only sound, the roar of the rain on the roof and the steady ticking of a small clock on the mantel. As she ate, Sable studied the wall over the fireplace. Pinned there, brittle with age, was a hand-drawn map. It was detailed, inked with care, showing the meanders of a creek labeled Dry Willow. Radiating from it were lines indicating irrigation ditches, pastures, and holding pens. The entire layout of Maddox Ridge was dependent on that single, winding blue line. Scrawled in the margins in charcoal were frantic, fading notes: April '87, level high, Oct 88, Lathrop fence line, and a new, darker note, just added: water level falling, dam upstream. This map wasn't just a survey. It was the ranch's beating heart, and it was failing. After the meal, she cleared the plates. Cole took a rifle from the wall pegs and began meticulously cleaning it by the lamplight. Sable took his heavy duck cloth coat from the peg. It was still damp. Holding it to the fire, she saw what she had only glimpsed before: a long tear in the shoulder seam, mended with thick, clumsy stitches in black thread that fought with the canvas. It was the work of a man whose hands were built for roping and digging, not for needles. A man who worked without pause, doing everything himself, even the things he did badly. She found a small tin box on a shelf, filled with fishing line, a few bent hooks, and 2 large, rust-tipped needles. She sat on the hearth, the coat across her lap, and with her small, sharp pocket knife, began to carefully unpick his clumsy work. The storm, which had settled into a steady downpour, suddenly reignited. A crack of thunder, so loud it shook the very foundations of the house, split the air. It was followed immediately by a high, panicked screaming, not human, but the sound of a horse in mortal terror. Cole was on his feet in an instant, rifle in hand. But Sable was already moving toward the door. Her mending dropped. She knew that sound. It was the sound of an animal trapped and blind with fear. "Stay inside," Cole ordered, grabbing the lantern. She ignored him, snatching her thin, wet shawl. "It's the mare. She'll break a leg on the fence." She was out the door and into the driving rain, sliding in the thick mud as she ran toward the corral. Cole was right behind her, the lantern light swinging wildly, cutting a yellow, chaotic arc in the blackness. The bay mare was frantic, rearing and crashing against the corral poles, her eyes white and rolling. The lightning flashed again, illuminating the scene in a stark, terrifying silhouette. "Whoa, now easy," Cole shouted, his voice barely audible over the wind. He was trying to get to the gate, but the horse, in her panic, was blocking him, threatening to trample him. Sable didn't hesitate. She didn't go for the gate. She slipped under the bottom rail of the fence on the far side, landing in the inches-deep mud. "Easy, girl," she cooed, her voice low and steady, a counter-rhythm to the storm. "Easy now. Just the sky making noise. You're safe." She kept talking. Nonsense words. A soft, crooning sound. She didn't reach for the bridle. She just moved slowly, sideways, letting the mare see her. The horse stopped its frantic crashing, turning to face this new, quiet thing in its enclosure. It snorted, trembling, its ears flicking between Sable and the sky. "That's it, girl," Sable murmured, edging closer. "It's just me." Cole, seeing his opening, had unlatched the heavy gate to the main stable, swinging it wide. "Bring her in. Miss Hart now." Sable reached out, her hand moving in a slow, patient arc, and laid it firmly on the mare's dripping neck. The animal flinched, but didn't pull away. Sable's touch was firm, not hesitant. "Come on, sweet girl. Let's get you inside." She walked, and after a moment's resistance, the horse followed, drawn by the calm in a world of chaos. Sable led her straight through the gate and into the dark, hay-scented safety of the barn. They stood for a long moment, inside, the rain hammering on the stable roof, both of them breathing hard. Cole hung the lantern on a hook, his expression unreadable in the dim light. They had moved together perfectly, without discussion. A two-person team acting on pure, shared instinct. He shut the heavy stable door, and the roar of the storm was instantly muffled. Back in the warm kitchen, they dripped on the floor for the second time that night. The unspoken question of her presence hung in the air, heavier than before. She was no longer just a victim of a prank. She had proven her worth. Sable went to the fire, turning her back to its warmth. She had to set the terms before the silence set them for her. "Mr. Maddox." He had returned to his seat, wiping the mud from his rifle stock. He looked up. "I won't be a charity case," she said, her voice quiet but firm, all the trembling from her arrival gone. "That prank, that was their shame, not mine, but I'll not be a burden on you." She met his gaze directly. "I can cook, I can clean, and I can mend. As you see." She gestured to the coat. "And I'm not afraid of livestock or hard work. I will earn my board and a place to sleep. The floor by the fire is fine in exchange for my labor. When this storm breaks, and I find honest-to-God paying work in town, I'll be on my way." Cole watched her. He saw the proud, straight line of her spine, the determination in her jaw. He saw the competence she'd shown with the fire, the food, and the horse, and he saw the exhaustion she was holding at bay. He finished wiping the stock, his movements slow, deliberate. "You are free, Miss Hart. Free to go, free to stay. The roof doesn't leak, and the work is endless." He paused. "You can stay as long as you need." It was an acceptance, not warm, but solid. His gaze dropped to her hands, which she was wringing together nervously. They were red, chapped, and trembling slightly. His eyes flicked, just once, to the pale, looped scar on her left wrist, stark against her skin. He didn't ask. The question how formed in his mind, but he swallowed it. He knew what kind of places left marks like that. Instead, he stood, went to a high shelf above the larder, and took down a small, round tin. He slid it across the table to her. It was unmarked. "The alkali in this water is hard on the skin," he said gruffly. "That'll help." She picked it up. It was a salve of pine resin and beeswax. It was practical. It was, in its own way, kind. Later, long after midnight, the storm had moved on, leaving a profound, rain-washed quiet. Cole had retired to his room, the door firmly shut. Sable had taken the threadbare blanket he'd left for her and made a bed on the floor near the hearth, the residual warmth a deep comfort. But she couldn't sleep. She found a stub of a pencil and a torn piece of brown wrapping paper. By the faint, dying glow of the embers, she slowly, painfully, formed the letters. Her spelling was a thing of guesswork, learned in brief, forgotten moments. "Thank you for the coat and the shelter." She left the small, rough scrap of paper on the table, where he would find it in the morning. It was the first time she had ever written a note without the biting fear of ridicule for her mistakes. The kettle on the stove began to whistle softly. She had refilled it before, an old habit. She sat at the end of the long table, the room silent save for the kettle's low song. He sat at the other, having returned from his room, apparently as restless as she. He was just sitting, staring into the embers. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It wasn't the charged, angry silence of before. It was the quiet of two solitary creatures, hunkered down, waiting out the night. It was an understanding, comfortable and deep. The stillness after the storm was louder than the rain had been. It was a silence filled with the drip of water from the eaves and the squelching sound of the mud settling. In the 3 days that followed, a fragile routine was forged at Maddox Ridge. Sable rose before the sun, the cold biting at her ankles as she coaxed the fire back to life. She learned the weight of Cole's silence. He would find his coffee hot when he came in from the pre-dawn check of the livestock, and she would find a full wood box when she went to start the stove. They moved around each other in the small house with an economy of motion. Two solitary animals sharing a den, bound not by affection, but by the shared, unspoken knowledge of vulnerability. On the fourth day, the wind dried the ground enough to make the track passable. The clear, cold air carried a new sound, the jangle of harness bells and the rumble of a heavy wagon. Sable, who was hanging Cole's mended canvas coat on the line, paused. A brightly painted peddler's wagon, pulled by two stout mules, was navigating the ruts toward the house. A woman, broad as the wagon seat she occupied, handled the reins. She wore a man's hat and a heavy fur-lined coat. She pulled the team to a halt and regarded Sable with eyes as sharp and black as obsidian chips. "Well, now," the woman boomed, her voice like gravel rolling in a tin bucket. "You ain't Cole." "No, ma'am," Sable said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. Maddox is checking the south fence line." "I see." The woman climbed down, her boots hitting the ground with a solid thud. "I'm Mrs. Griggs. I pass through here 4 times a year. Got everything from needles to notions, coffee to cartridges. You the new help?" The question hung in the air, loaded. Sable felt the familiar flush of shame, the ghost of the Lathrop's laughter. "I'm helping for my board, temporarily." Mrs. Griggs seemed to accept this. "Best kind of help. Cole needs it. Lord knows, he's too proud to ask." She unlatched the back of her wagon, revealing a cornucopia of goods. "Heard about that nasty prank at the post office? That was the Lathrop boys. Mark my words. They got their father's money, but their mother's mean streak." Sable busied herself, selecting the spools of heavy thread she needed to repair the ranch's feed sacks. "I met them," she said quietly. "Mrs. Griggs stopped, her hand hovering over a box of soap. "Did you now? Well, you keep your distance. That family, they ain't just playing pranks anymore." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial rumble. "I just came from Mesita Bluff. Word is, Lathrop Sr. wants the water. He's been buying up every note he can, pressuring the bank examiners. They say he aims to own every drop that flows in the dry willow." Sable looked up, the thread forgotten. "He wants the creek." "He wants the rights to the creek," Mrs. Griggs corrected. "He controls the water. He controls this entire valley. And the only thing standing in his way is this ranch. He's trying to choke Cole out, make him sell for pennies on the dollar." A cold dread, heavier than the morning chill, settled on Sable. She looked at the dry, thirsty land around them, and then at the map she knew hung over the hearth. Later that day, another rider approached. This wasn't a stranger. He was an older man, wiry and tough as boiled leather, leading a pack mule. He dismounted, his joints popping, and squinted at Sable, who was turning the soil in a small, hopeful garden patch near the house. "You must be the one," he said. His voice was dry, like the wind through the juniper. "I'm Sable Hart." "Rook," he replied, giving a curt nod. "I'm Cole's hand. When he can pay me." He looked over the ranch, his gaze lingering on the mended fence by the corral. The clean-swept porch. "Place looks better." Sable offered him the coffee that was always hot on the stove. He took the mug, wrapping his gnarled fingers around the warmth. He drank half of it in one go before speaking again. Mrs. Griggs passed through. "This morning." "Figured. She smells news like a buzzard smells a body." Rook grunted. "She tell you about the Lathrops?" "She said they want the water." "They want the land," Rook corrected, his voice hardening. "The water's just the knife. I've worked for the Maddox family since Cole was a boy. This ranch was his father's, and his father's before. The Lathrops always wanted it. Old man Lathrop and Cole's PA had a feud that went back to the war." He spat into the dust. "Those boys, Jeb and Wiley, they used to just poison wells, cut fences, mean, stupid things. But that advertisement, that was different. That was smart, and it was cruel." He looked directly at Sable, his eyes sharp. They're trying to break him. Not just his finances, his spirit. They know he's alone. They want to make him sell cheap and crawl away. Don't you let him." He finished his coffee, handed her the mug, and moved off toward the barn, leaving Sable with another piece of the dark puzzle. The puzzle became terrifyingly clear the next afternoon. Cole had asked her to check the irrigation ditch that ran from the dry willow to the lower pasture to see how much water the storm had truly brought. It wasn't much. The creek was a sluggish, muddy ribbon, barely a foot deep. As she walked the bank, her skirt catching on the brittle sagebrush, she saw something new. It was a wooden stake, driven deep into the earth, not 10 feet from the water's edge. It was freshly cut, the axe marks clean and white. She walked further, another, and another, a new, perfectly straight line, cutting across a wide bend in the creek, and on the top of each stake was a daub of bright, garish red paint. Sable stopped, her heart hammering. Red, the color of the wax seal on the Lathrop banking house stationery. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a rumor. This was a claim. They were redrawing the boundaries, claiming the land that held the water. It was a silent, arrogant declaration of war. She needed supplies, and Cole couldn't be spared from the ranch. The fence line to the north was still down, and the small herd was at risk. He gave her the wagon, the placid mare, and a short list salt, cartridges, kerosene. The journey to Mesita Bluff was tense. Every rider she saw in the distance made her jump. When she arrived, she felt the stares. Mrs. Griggs's news had preceded her. She was the woman from the prank, the one living at Maddox Ridge. She ignored the whispers, tying the mare outside the general store, her shoulders squared. Her last stop was the small adobe mission at the edge of town. She didn't go to pray, but because Cole's list included a word with the padre. She found him tending a small chili patch in the mission's courtyard. He was a small, weathered man in a simple brown cassock, his face a map of deep lines, his eyes kind. "Senorita Hart," he said, not looking up from his weeding. He, too, knew who she was. "You come from Maddox Ridge. How is Cole?" "He is a good man, a sad man, but good." "He's holding on, Father," Sable said. "Ah, holding on." Padre Esteban stood, wiping his earthy hands on his cassock. "It is what we do here in the desert. We hold on, but it is not always enough." He looked at her, his gaze penetrating. "I have heard the whispers. The Lathrop family grows bold. They are men who believe God is spelled Gold. He handed her a small bundle of dried herbs she hadn't asked for. "For the stew," he said simply. "Tell me, child, when the coyotes want to take down a lone steer, what do? Do they attack from the front?" "No," Sable said, remembering the packs she'd heard howling in the night. They harry it. They nip at its heels. They run it until it's too tired to fight, until it's isolated." "Exactly." The padre nodded, his dark eyes sad. "They isolate it. They make it seem that the steer is alone, that the herd will not help. They make it weak in its own mind before they ever go for the throat. Do not let them leave their prey alone on the prairie. Mija, a wounded lion is still a lion, but even a lion cannot fight from 3 directions at once." His words, heavy with meaning, followed her all the way back to the ranch. She was unhitching the mare in the growing twilight, the barn smelling of hay and old leather. As she forked fresh hay into the stall, she saw something wedged in the dark space between a stack of rotted feed sacks and the wall. It was a crumpled piece of paper. Her first instinct was to use it for tinder, but she paused. It was too stiff, too fine. She pulled it out. It was an envelope. Expensive linen stock, the kind a bank would use. It was blank, slightly damp, and creased, but in the upper corner, embossed so deeply she could feel it with her thumb, was the crest of the Lathrop banking house. She stood frozen in the hay-scented dimness, in the hayshed, Not in town. Here. Someone had been here. They had been on the property, in the barn, close enough to see, to watch, to plan. She ran to the house. Cole was at the table. The map of the dry willows spread out under the lamplight. His face grim. He was marking the new, lower water level. She didn't speak. She just slammed the crumpled envelope down on the map. "What's this?" he asked, his voice tired. "I found it, in the hay shed, wedged behind the sacks." He picked it up, his brow furrowed. "Lathrop's." He looked at her, confused. "It's just trash." "It's the paper," she said, her voice shaking with a sudden, cold fury. "It's the same paper as the advertisement, the one I received." Cole went utterly still. The dots connected, instant and violent. The prank, the riders on the ridge, the red stakes, and now this. They hadn't just posted the ad in a faraway town. They had been here. They had stood in his barn, on his land, and crafted the lie. It was a violation so profound it stole his breath. His eyes, normally the color of a winter sky, darkened to black. The controlled, quiet grief he carried was instantly consumed by a pure, glacial rage. "They meant to ruin me," he whispered, his voice vibrating. "Not just the ranch, me. They paint me as a man so desperate he has to buy a wife from an advertisement." He crushed the envelope in his massive fist. "Then they parade my failure, and yours, in front of the whole town." He turned away from her, his shoulders rigid. He slammed his open palm against the rough adobe wall by the hearth. A sharp, dull thud that shook the shelf above it. The silver ring rattled. He stared at the ring. The anger drained away as quickly as it had come, leaving a vast, hollow ache. "They know I'm alone," he said, his back still to her. His voice was raw. "They've known it since Mary, since my wife." Sable waited. The silence was agonizing. "Winter fever," he said, the words torn from him. 4 years ago, the snow was 8 feet deep in the drifts. She was burning. I couldn't get her to the army doctor at Fort Stanton. I waited. I thought the storm would break." He closed his eyes, the memory vivid and suffocating. "It didn't. By the time I could get the wagon through, it was too late. I buried her, on the ridge, where she could see the water." He carried the guilt like a second skeleton. "I wasn't fast enough. I didn't save her." Sable stepped forward, standing not beside him, but near him. The air crackled with his pain. "They are playing dirty, Cole," she said, her voice low and steady, not with pity, but with a matching, steely anger. "They used your grief against you, and they used my hope against me." He finally turned to look at her. He saw the woman who had calmed his horse in the storm, the woman who had faced down the whispers in town, the woman who now stood in his kitchen, her eyes clear and fierce. "They made a mistake," she said. "They thought they were setting a trap for one person, but they caught two." A silent, powerful understanding passed between them. This was no longer his solitary burden, and it was no longer her temporary shelter. It was their shared battleground. He nodded. A single, sharp movement. He grabbed the charcoal pencil from the table and a fresh piece of wrapping paper from her supplies. He strode to the door and looked at the last, fading light of the sunset. "Let's fix the line," he said. They went out into the cold dusk. To the ditch, they found the main boundary marker. A heavy stone cairn had been kicked over, its rocks scattered. Together, without speaking, they heaved the stones back into place. Cole unfolded his map, weighting it with a rock. "The light's almost gone. We need a record of those new stakes." He handed her the charcoal and the paper. "You do it. Your hand is steadier." She knelt in the dirt. The paper braced on her knee. In the dying, amber light, she began to sketch. She didn't draw with the flourish of an artist, but with the precision of a surveyor. She drew the creek's bend, the line of their ditch, and then the arrogant straight red line of the new stakes. "They're 10 yards inside your line here," she murmured, pointing. "And at the bend, it's closer to 20. Cole watched her. The wind picked up, pulling strands of her dark hair across her face. But she didn't brush them away. The last of the sun's fire caught the sharp line of her jaw and the intense, focused concentration in her eyes. He saw, for the first time, not the woman who had arrived soaked and humiliated, but the woman who was kneeling in the dirt, mapping his defense. He recognized the quality in her, the same quality that kept him here, a quiet, unbending, durable bravery. He found himself holding his breath, just watching the firelight of the sky trace the curve of her cheek. A shadow passed over them, swift and sudden. Both looked up, high above, catching the last thermal of the dying day. A single red-tailed hawk circled. It hung suspended in the twilight, a perfect, effortless predator. Its head tilted, its gaze fixed on the darkening earth below. It was a silent, ominous reminder. The strong were watching, the strong were patient, and they were waiting for the perfect moment to fall. The truce forged in the storm held for a week. It was a quiet, working truce, measured in the shared rhythms of survival. The ranch held its breath, waiting. The hawk, Sable knew, was still circling. The attack came in the dead of night, on the dark of the moon. Sable was a light sleeper. The trauma of the trailside inn had left her with an animal's awareness, an ear tuned to the snap of a twig or the scrape of a boot. She was on her cot near the hearth, the house wrapped in a profound silence, broken only by the low sigh of the wind in the chimney and the steady breathing of Cole from his room down the hall. What woke her was not a loud noise, but a wrong one. A soft scrape, then a metallic clink, and finally a dull, distant thud followed by a faint splash. Her eyes snapped open. The fire was down to red-gold embers, casting just enough light to see the room's familiar shadows. She held her breath, listening. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was the sound of a heavy rope being dragged over the wooden lip of the well. Someone was outside. Sable moved without a sound. She didn't rise. She rolled from the cot onto her stomach, the cold plank floor shocking her skin through her thin nightgown. She stayed low, crawling on hands and knees to the kitchen wall. Her hand found the cool, familiar stock of the 10-gauge shotgun Cole kept hanging on 2 pegs. It was heavy, loaded with shot meant for coyotes or rabbits. As she brought it down, a shadow detached itself from the hallway. Cole. He was already awake, already dressed in his trousers, his rifle in his hand. He hadn't lit a lamp. He saw her, a pale shape in the dark, armed and ready. He didn't question her. He didn't tell her to stay put. He simply acknowledged his new ally. He brought one hand up, motioning toward the back door, which led toward the barn. Then he pointed to the front porch, and then to himself. "They'll expect me at the front. You take the back, flank them." Sable nodded, her heart a cold, hard knot in her chest. He moved to the front door, silent as smoke. Sable crept to the back. She eased the latch, praying the old wood wouldn't groan. It gave a slight shriek. Outside, the scraping sound stopped. Silence. Sable held her breath, counting the gusts of wind. Just as Cole had taught her. Use the noise to cover your own, on the next sigh of the wind. She pulled the door open just wide enough to slip through and pressed herself flat against the cold adobe wall of the house. The night was black, the stars obscured by a high, thin veil of clouds. The air smelled of cold dust. She could hear nothing but the wind and the thud of her own blood in her ears. She waited 5 seconds, 10. Then she heard it again, a low, muttered curse, carried on the breeze from the direction of the well, which sat in the open yard between the house and the barn. She began to move, keeping the shotgun held low, its twin barrels pointed at the ground. She rounded the corner of the house, staying deep in the shadows. She could just make out a dark figure hunched over the wellhead, working at something. A boot scraped on the porch planking at the front of the house. Cole. The figure at the well shot up, panicked. "Hell!" a man's voice yelped. He turned and ran, not back toward the main track, but toward the irrigation ditch, toward the cover of the gully. He was running straight toward her. "Halt!" Sable's voice was steadier and louder than she thought possible. The running shadow didn't slow. He was a bulk of darkness, charging, fumbling with something at his belt. Sable didn't aim for the man. She aimed for the space just above his head. She braced the stock against her shoulder, just as she'd seen Cole do, and pulled the trigger. The boom of the 10-gauge was a physical blow, a deafening concussion that ripped the night in two. The orange flash momentarily illuminated the yard, freezing the scene, the wide-eyed, terrified face of a man she didn't recognize, his mouth open in a scream. The buckshot pattern tore the air where his head had been. His hat, knocked clean from his skull, vaporized in a cloud of felt and dust. The man shrieked, a high, thin sound of pure terror. He tripped over his own feet, flailing, and tumbled head over heels down the steep bank of the empty irrigation ditch. He landed with a heavy, muddy thump. For a second, he lay still. Then, scrambling and sobbing, he crab-walked away in the mud, a string of curses and whimpers trailing behind him until the darkness swallowed him whole. The silence that rushed back in was absolute, thick with the acrid smell of burnt gunpowder. Cole was at her side in an instant, his rifle sweeping the darkness. "You hit—" "No," she said, her voice trembling now that the danger was past. The shotgun was impossibly heavy. He took it from her, his hand briefly brushing hers. He raised the lantern he'd grabbed from the porch. The light cut a yellow circle. On the ground lay the ruined, shredded hat. At the well, the thick hemp rope was gone. Cut. The wooden bucket had been dropped to the bottom. A good 40 feet down, their main source of household water was gone. "Petty, cowardly," Cole began, his voice a low growl. He kicked the hat. "Cole," Sable said, her voice tight. She was pointing the lantern not at the well, but at the ground by the gate of the small cattle pen. He moved the light. It glinted off dozens of small, sharp points scattered in the mud, right where the 4 head of cattle his entire herd would walk out in the morning. Cole knelt, his face hardening into a mask of cold fury. He picked one up. It was a broad-headed roofing nail, new and sharp. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't petty vandalism. This was a calculated, vicious attempt to destroy his livelihood, to lame his animals, to bleed him dry. "He cut the rope to draw us out," Cole said, his voice deadly quiet. "While we were running around, he was supposed to finish this." Sable felt a sickness rise in her. The Lathrops weren't just trying to scare him. They were trying to cripple him. The next morning, Cole rode into Mesita Bluff, the shredded hat and a handful of nails in his saddlebag. Sable insisted on coming. They needed a new rope, and she had a list of her own. Sheriff Dawes was tilted back in his chair, boots on his desk, cleaning his fingernails with a pocket knife. He listened to Cole's clipped, angry report with a profound, insulting boredom. "Well now, Maddox," Dawes said, finally looking up with a long, slow yawn. "That's quite a story. A man in the dark. You didn't see his face. This woman of yours. She didn't see his face. All you got is a hat full of holes and some nails. Could be your nails. People get careless." "I wasn't careless. Dawes," Cole said, his voice tight. "This was the Lathrops. You got proof you see Jeb or Wiley Lathrop out there, or you just suppose underscore and underscore." The sheriff leaned forward, his friendly mask gone. "You're accusing the biggest depositor in the bank. Son, you better have more than a feeling and a ruined hat. I can't arrest a man for what you think. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm busy." He gestured to his desk. "Lack of evidence?" Cole stood there for a long moment. his hands balled into fists, his entire body radiating a killing rage. Sable put a light hand on his forearm. He looked at her, then, with a curt nod, turned and slammed out of the office. The street was busy. It was market day, and the Lathrop's second attack was already underway. As Cole and Sable walked toward the general store, the normal bustle of the town slowed. People stopped talking. Men looked away. Women, gathered in small groups, whispered behind their hands, their eyes darting to Sable. Jeb and Wiley Lathrop were holding court on the boardwalk, lounging on packing crates. They weren't armed, but they didn't need to be. Their wealth was a weapon. "Well, well," Jeb Lathrop called out, his voice oily and loud, pitched for the entire street to hear. "If it ain't the rancher, Cole Maddox. Heard you had some excitement last night. Cole, trouble with trespassers." Cole didn't stop, just kept walking, his gaze fixed straight ahead. Wiley, the meaner of the two, snickered. Maybe he was just entertaining his guest. He drawled the word, loading it with insinuation. "Word is, Maddox, you're keeping a woman out there, one you hired from an advertisement. Must be lonely, not having a real wife." The shot hit its mark. Cole stopped dead. The reference to his late wife was a blade twisted in a fresh wound. Sable felt the eyes of the entire town on her. She was the kept woman. The whispers were arrows. Hired help. That's her. No better than... Her face burned. Her first instinct was to shrink, to hide behind Cole's broad back. Her hand, clutching her small coin purse, began to tremble. Then she thought of the nails in the mud. She thought of Cole's face when he saw the silver ring. She thought of the cold-blooded, arrogant cruelty. She lifted her chin. Her hand was still shaking, but her eyes were steady. She stepped around Cole and walked straight past the Lathrop brothers, up the steps, and into the general store. The crowd on the boardwalk parted for her as if she carried a disease. Inside, she slapped her handwritten list on the counter. The clerk, a young man named Peterson, looked embarrassed. Miss Hart, what can I need 20 yards of your best hemp rope," she said, her voice clear and carrying. 5 pounds of 10-penny nails, a box of cartridges for a 10-gauge, and a pound of potassium permanganate. Her handwriting on the list was precise, the items listed in a neat column. She was trembling, but she stood as straight as a rifle barrel. As she began to count her coins onto the counter, the bright morning sun streamed through the store's large front window. It hit her full in the face, illuminating the faint tremor in her hands, the dust on her dress, exposing her to the prying eyes of the entire street. She flinched, blinded, and then the sun was gone. Cole had moved. He had followed her in, and now he stood between her and the window. He said nothing. He didn't look at her, or the clerk, or the Lathrops. He just stood there, a mountain of quiet fury, blocking the light, blocking the stairs. He shielded her. She finished counting, her hands suddenly steady. They rode back in silence. When they reached the irrigation ditch, Cole pulled the wagon to a halt. They sat for a long time, looking at the muddy gash in the earth where the intruder had fled. "They'll be back," Cole said. It was a flat statement of fact. "They know Dawes won't stop them. They'll come back, and they'll finish the job." Sable stared at the wide, shallow mouth of the ditch. He used it to escape. He knew it was there. It's the easiest way onto the property without being seen from the house. Cole agreed. "Then let's make it the hardest," Sable said, thinking aloud. She pointed. "The banks are low here, where it meets the gully, wide. They can ride a horse right up it. But what if they couldn't?" Cole looked at her. "We get the shovels," she said, her voice gaining strength. "We build a berm, an earth wall, right here, across the mouth. We narrow the opening to just a tiny channel for the water. And we build the walls up high and steep, too steep to ride up. They'll have to get off their horses and climb it, on foot, in the mud. It'll be loud, and it'll slow them down. Cole stared at the ditch, his mind seeing her plan. He traced the line of her proposed wall. It was smart. It was defensive. It was the work of someone who understood terrain, water, and desperation. He turned his head and looked at her. The grim, hard line of his mouth softened. A slow, rusty, unfamiliar expression pulled at the corners of his lips. It was a smile. It was the first time she had ever seen it. It transformed his face, wiping away the grief and rage, leaving something warm. "You think like a waterman, Miss Hart," he said. The words were few, but they were the deepest compliment he could pay. That night, their muscles aching from hours of digging, they sat by the fire. The tension of the last 24 hours had broken, leaving behind the quiet, exhausted satisfaction of a shared victory. They hadn't just survived the attack, they had answered it. Sable was roasting ears of late-season corn over the embers, the kernels popping and smoking. She was quiet for a long time, watching the flames. "My mother," she said, her voice soft. "She used to make corn cakes in a cast-iron skillet, right on the coals. She didn't have much, no proper kitchen." Cole stopped cleaning the new rope, listening. "She always burned the first one," Sable continued, a tiny ghost of a smile on her own face. "She'd peel it off, all black and smoky, and give it to me. She said the burned bits were the sweetest. I just remember the smell. Wood smoke and hot corn." She looked up, her eyes shimmering in the firelight, but her expression was calm, her tears held in check. She wasn't asking for pity. She was sharing a piece of her past that hadn't been scarred, a small, good memory she had kept hidden. Cole said nothing. He just nodded, accepting the story, letting the comfortable, smoky silence fill the space between them. The berm held for 3 weeks. The scar of new earth at the mouth of the irrigation ditch stood as a silent, defiant rampart. A fragile peace settled over Maddox Ridge, a peace born not of resolution but of exhaustion. The days shortened, the air grew a knife's-edge sharpness, and a weary, watchful rhythm took hold. They worked from can't see to can't see, reinforcing the barn roof, salting the last of the pork, digging a new root cellar. They spoke little, but a language of shared labor flowed between them. He would find a bucket of fresh water waiting for him. She would find a pile of perfectly split kindling by the hearth. It was a partnership forged in crisis, now being tested by the slow grind of daily survival. Then the sky fell. It began not with thunder, but with a slow, gray suffocation. The clouds descended from the mesas, thick and wet and low, snagging on the tops of the juniper trees. A cold mist turned into a drizzle, and the drizzle turned into a relentless, soul-chilling downpour. It wasn't a violent storm like the first one. It was a siege. The rain hammered the hard-packed earth, turning the yard into a quagmire of red mud. They had been trying to get the last of the hay under cover, a frantic race against the darkening sky. The rain caught them in the open, 100 yards from the barn. It was instantly drenching, so cold it felt like being pelted with chips of ice. "Leave it!" Cole shouted over the roar of the downpour, his voice a raw command. "To the house." They ran, slipping and sliding in the slick mud, the icy water plastering their clothes to their skin. They burst into the kitchen, gasping, shedding water like a pair of drowned animals. The sudden, profound quiet inside was a shock. The sound of the rain on the roof, now a muffled, drumming roar. Sable stood shivering, her thin wool dress clinging to her, her hair streaming water down her face and neck. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably. "Get out of those clothes," Cole said, his voice rough with concern. He didn't look at her. He was already moving, his back to her, throwing fresh logs onto the embers in the hearth. The fire hissed and spat as a river of water ran from his own slicker onto the stone. But soon the new wood caught, and a wave of intense, Welcome heat began to radiate into the room. He gestured with his head toward the tall, three-panel screen she used for privacy in the corner. "Go on. You'll catch your death." He still hadn't looked at her. He busied himself at the stove, his movements stiff, as if he were deliberately keeping himself occupied. Sable, grateful for his averted gaze, took the blanket from her cot and slipped behind the screen. Her fingers were numb, clumsy as she worked the buttons of her dress. The wet wool peeled away from her skin with a cold, sucking sound. She scrubbed herself dry as best she could with a rough towel, her body shaking violently. She had nothing dry to wear except her thin nightgown, which would be useless against the chill that had settled deep in her bones. A soft thud made her jump. On the chair just outside the screen, a folded garment had appeared. It was one of his own shirts, made of thick, soft flannel, worn from 1,000 washings. Beside it was a pair of woolen socks. He had placed them there and retreated, his boots making soft, squelching sounds as he moved back to the fire. It was an act of such simple, profound consideration that it brought a lump to her throat. She pulled the shirt on. It was huge on her, swallowing her small frame. The hem fell to her knees, and the sleeves hung far past her hands. But it was blessedly dry, and it smelled of him not of sweat and labor, but of clean wind, wood smoke, and something else, something uniquely his own. She rolled up the sleeves and stepped out from behind the screen. Cole was standing by the fire, staring into the flames. He heard the soft shuffle of her stockinged feet on the plank floor and turned. He stopped breathing for a second. The firelight turned the room to gold and shadow. It caught the damp, dark strands of her hair, which she had unpinned and now hung in loose waves around her shoulders. The oversized shirt, meant for a man's broad frame, somehow made her seem even more delicate, more vulnerable. Her face was scrubbed clean, pale in the flickering light, her eyes wide and dark. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He picked up a clean, dry towel from the mantel. "Your hair," he said, his voice husky. He held it out to her. She stepped closer, into the circle of warmth from the fire, and reached for it. As she took it, his calloused fingers, rough from rope and wood and iron, brushed against the tender inside of her wrist. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot up her arm. She gasped softly. His hand recoiled as if he'd touched a hot skillet. Their eyes met. In his, she saw a reflection of her own shock, a sudden, unexpected awareness that had nothing to do with the cold or the rain. The air between them, which had been filled with the comfortable silence of work, was suddenly charged, humming with a new and dangerous energy. He was the first to look away. He turned back to the fire, his shoulders tense. I'll make some cocoa," he mumbled, moving toward the larder. "To warm you." Sable stood rooted to the spot, her wrist tingling where he had touched it. She slowly began to towel her hair, the simple, repetitive motion a way to calm the frantic beating of her heart. He worked with a clumsy, focused intensity, as if the simple act of heating milk and mixing in the precious chocolate powder required all of his concentration. He brought 2 steaming mugs to the small wooden bench he dragged in front of the hearth. "Here," he said, not meeting her eyes. She sat, curling her cold fingers around the warm ceramic. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the flames dance and listening to the storm, the warmth of the fire, the rich, sweet scent of the cocoa, and the steady, drumming rhythm of the rain began to work their magic, unknotting the tension in their muscles, lowering their guards. "I used to dream about this," Sable said, her voice so soft it was almost a part of the fire's crackle. Cole turned his head, his expression questioning. "Freedom," she clarified, staring into the fire. "When I was at the inn, when things were bad, I would close my eyes and try to imagine what it was, and it was always this." She took a sip of the cocoa. "It wasn't a place. It was a feeling, the feeling of being warm when it's cold outside, the feeling of being safe when there's a storm, the feeling of of being able to sit down, just for a minute, without someone shouting for you or telling you that you've done something wrong. She looked at him, her eyes clear and direct. The freedom to just breathe. He listened. He didn't offer platitudes or easy reassurances. He just listened, his full attention on her. She saw the hard, protective shell he wore begin to soften. The constant, weary tension in his shoulders eased. The grim, tight line of his jaw relaxed. His eyes, usually so guarded, were softer now, the color of a morning mist. He was seeing her, she realized, not as a problem or a burden or even as help. He was seeing her. A sudden, violent flash of lightning lit the room in a stark, blue-white glare, followed a split second later by a deafening crack of thunder that seemed to shake the house to its very foundations. Sable cried out, a small, involuntary sound of shock, and jerked violently, spilling a little of the hot cocoa on her hand. Before the thunder had finished echoing, Cole had moved. His hand, large and warm, came to rest on her side, just over her ribs. It wasn't a tentative touch. It was firm, solid, grounding. He didn't flinch away this time. His thumb pressed gently against her, a steadying pressure through the thick flannel of the shirt. "You're safe," he whispered, his voice a low rumble. The words were more than a comment on the storm. They were a promise. His warmth seeped through the fabric, chasing away the last of the deep-seated chill. She stopped trembling. She looked from his hand on her side to his face, so close in the firelight. Slowly, tentatively, testing the fragile new ground between them. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He went rigid. She could feel every muscle in his body tense, a lifetime of solitude and grief warring with this sudden, unexpected intimacy. She held her breath, ready to pull back at the slightest sign of rejection. For a long, agonizing moment, he didn't move. Then, with a slow, shuddering exhale, he relaxed. The tension flowed out of him. He didn't pull her closer, but he didn't push her away. He simply allowed it. She felt the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing under her cheek. After a moment, her own breathing fell into sync with his. The world narrowed to the sound of the rain, the crackle of the fire, and the shared, quiet rhythm of two people breathing as one. His hand was still on her side. After what seemed like an eternity, it moved. His fingers spread, sliding from her ribs to the gentle curve of her hip, even through the thick flannel. His touch was electric. He hesitated, his thumb stroking the fabric in a small, uncertain circle. Then, with a gentle, inexorable pressure, he drew her closer, tucking her against his side. A small, involuntary sound escaped Sable's throat. It was a sigh, a soft exhalation of breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. It was the sound of a wall, carefully constructed over years of hardship, finally beginning to crumble. She tilted her head back to look up at him. His face was in shadow, but she could see the question in his eyes, a silent, vulnerable query. "Is this all right?" She didn't need words. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then she answered him more fully. She lifted her hand, not to his shoulder, but to the back of his neck, her fingers tangling in the thick, soft hair at his nape. It was all the invitation he needed. He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. It wasn't a kiss of desperate passion or pent-up demand. It was a kiss of discovery. It was slow and sweet and deeply hesitant at first, as if he had forgotten how. His lips were soft, questioning. She answered, her own lips parting slightly. The kiss deepened, a slow, warm tide rising between them. It tasted of chocolate and wood smoke and the rain. It was a kiss that spoke of loneliness and comfort and a shared, dawning hope. She felt a tremor run through him, a lifetime of stored-up sorrow and solitude beginning to yield. He shifted, turning more fully toward her, his other hand coming up to cup her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. "Keep me closer," she whispered against his lips, the words a raw, honest plea. His hand on her hip tightened, sliding lower, the heel of his palm settling against the small of her back. He lifted her slightly, shifting her so she was nestled more fully against him. A soft, breathless moan escaped her, a sound of pure, unadulterated warmth, of feeling wanted in a way that was safe, in a way that was right. They kissed for a long time, the world outside forgotten. The kisses were unhurried, punctuated by moments where they would pull back, just enough to look at each other in the firelight, their foreheads touching. Small, soft smiles bloomed in the space between them, smiles of wonder and disbelief. His hands roamed over the thick flannel covering her back and sides, learning her shape, while hers stayed tangled in his hair, holding him close. It was a conversation without words, a perfect, silent consensus. The fire burned low, the flames turning to soft, glowing embers. The storm passed. The rain softened to a gentle, pattering whisper on the roof. Outside, the world was being washed clean. Inside, so were they. He finally drew back, his breath warm on her cheek. He brushed a stray strand of hair from her forehead, his touch infinitely gentle. Her hand slid from his neck to rest on his chest, feeling the steady, strong beat of his heart beneath her palms. He held her gaze for a long moment, his eyes filled with an emotion she couldn't name, but that felt like coming home. He leaned in and kissed her one last time, a soft, chaste kiss on her forehead. Then he stood, pulling the thickest blanket from his own bed in the other room. He draped it over her as she curled up on the bench, which was long enough to serve as a makeshift bed. Their hands clasped for a moment, fingers intertwined, a silent, binding promise. Then he released her. He didn't return to his room. He took the remaining blanket, sat in the worn armchair on the other side of the now dying fire, and watched over her as she drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep. The first light of dawn was a pale, pearly gray, filtering through the clean-washed windows. Sable awoke slowly, feeling warmer and more deeply rested than she had in years. She was lying on the bench, the heavy wool blanket tucked securely around her shoulders. The fire in the hearth was already crackling, a cheerful, steady blaze against the morning chill. Cole was gone, but on the small table beside her, next to a fresh, steaming mug of coffee he had left for her, was a scrap of brown wrapping paper. On it, in his rough, slightly clumsy handwriting, was a single sentence. "If you want to, we'll talk. Respect first, passion second." The door was open, but the choice to walk through it was entirely hers. The morning after the storm. The note sat on the table between them. "If you want to, we'll talk." Sable found him by the corral, checking the mare's hoof. The world was washed clean, the air so cold and clear it felt brittle. She had braided her hair tight, a practical, warrior-like gesture. She carried the empty coffee mug and the piece of paper. "I want to talk," she said. He finished his work, letting the hoof down gently, and straightened. He didn't look at her, not at first. He looked at the ridge, at the new, raw earth of their berm. He was afraid, she realized, not of her, but of what she might say. Afraid that the night by the fire had been a mistake, a response to the storm that the daylight would retract. "I want to talk about the water," she said, her voice steady, pulling his gaze back. "And the Lathrops? I'm not just earning my board anymore. Cole, I'm staying. I'm in this. We have to fight them. And not just with shotguns in the dark. We have to beat them at their own game." The tension in his shoulders, the fear of rejection, vanished. It was replaced by a deep, profound relief that was almost staggering. She wasn't running. The intimacy of the previous night hadn't scared her off. It had forged her. "All right, Sable," he said, his voice quiet. but with a new, solid core of partnership. We fight. How? With paper, she said. They use lawyers and fake ads. We use history. They have money. We have to find something they don't. Her mind, sharpened by years of having to think 5 steps ahead just to survive, was already working. I'm going to Mesita Bluff. I'm going to see the Padre. Padre Esteban was sweeping the terracotta tiles of his courtyard, a small, quiet oasis of order. He looked up as Sable entered, and a small smile touched his lips. He had seen her at the market, seen the way she stood, the way Cole had shielded her. Ah, mija, he greeted her. You have come for prayer for guidance. I've come for ammunition, father, Sable said, shelving any pretense. You keep the mission records. They're the oldest records in this territory. Aren't they baptisms, deaths, land? The Padre's smile faded, replaced by a keen, shrewd intelligence. The Lathrops are men of the New World. Child, they respect only fresh ink on signed contracts. But their contracts are for land, Sable pressed, her urgency making her bold. I need to prove the water. I need to find something that shows the Dry Willow Ditch belonged to this ranch long before Elias Lathrop ever opened his bank. Something Sheriff Dawes can't ignore. He understood. He led her into the cool, dark sacristy, the air smelling of old paper, beeswax, and incense. He pulled a massive, leather-bound ledger from a locked chest. The pages were thick vellum. The ink faded from black to a rusty brown. These are the mission grants and parish records, he said, his voice low, from before the territory was even a state. For an hour, she pored over the spidery, elegant script, her finger tracing lists of births and marriages, all tied to land parcels. And then she found it. It was in a record from 1862, a note in the margin, next to a baptismal entry for a child of the first Maddox, Cole's grandfather. The entry described the family's property bordered on the south by their own diversion ditch from the Dry Willow, as witnessed and recorded. The entry was countersigned by the acting territorial marshal of the day, a man named Miller, Sheriff Dawes' predecessor, twice removed. This is it, Sable whispered, her hand trembling. This was a legal, historical claim to the ditch itself. The Padre, seeing the fire in her eyes, carefully transcribed a copy for her, pressing the mission's official seal into a blob of wax at the bottom. But paper wasn't enough. They still needed water. The storm's runoff had been a temporary reprieve, but the creek was already receding. Lathrop's dam, or whatever he was using upstream, was still slowly, relentlessly, choking them. Back in Mesita Bluff, Sable stopped at the Territorial Land Office. She didn't ask about Maddox Ridge. She asked about the land north of it. I heard there were old silver mines up in the canyons, she said to the clerk. Long since played out. The clerk, bored, hauled out a different set of maps. 3 of them, he grunted. The Hopeful, the Prospector's Folly, and the Red Dog. All went bust by 75. Sable paid for copies, her coin purse significantly lighter. That night, she spread the 3 mining maps on the kitchen table under the lamplight. Cole and Rook, who had come by for a strategy meeting, stared at them, confused. This is just chicken scratch, Missy, Rook said, tapping the map for the Red Dog. This claims a full mile east of the creek. But look, Sable said, her excitement growing. She took her charcoal pencil. This is the Dry Willow here. She traced it. But on this map, from 10 years earlier, she slid the Hopeful map underneath. The creek bed is marked here, and on this one, she added the Prospector's Folly. It's marked in a different place again. The creek moves, Cole said, his voice flat. No, Sable said, her eyes bright. The creek split. Look. She overlapped the maps, aligning them by a single, constant landmark, a granite outcrop called Widow's Peak. When the maps were layered, a new picture emerged, the main channel, The one they knew was just one branch. Another, smaller channel had once forked off, run for 2 miles, and then rejoined the main creek. The mining operations, Sable whispered, pointing. They dumped their tailings. They choked this second branch. They killed it. She looked at Cole, her realization hitting them both at once. Where did this branch run? Cole! He stared at the map. Right through the old willow grove, the one that's been dead for 20 years. He grabbed the lantern. Rook, get the picks. They dug for an hour in the cold moonlight, the thud of the pickaxes echoing in the dead grove. It was hard, compacted, lifeless earth. It's no use, Cole, Rook panted, wiping his forehead. This is a fool's errand. We're chasing a ghost. Wait, Sable said. She had dropped to her knees, crumbling the dirt in her hand. It was cold, but it felt different. It felt damp. Here, dig here. Cole trusted her. He swung the pickaxe with all his strength. It bit deep into the earth. The sound changed, from a dull thud to a wet, sucking sloop. He pulled the pick free. A small, dark bubble of water welled up in the hole. Then another. He swung again, and again. Suddenly, with a groan, the compacted earth gave way. A steady, living trickle of cold, clear water burst from the ground. It wasn't a river, but it was a new artery. It was life. They worked frantically, clearing the channel, and watched as the small, determined stream flowed out of the dead grove and ran, straight and true, into their parched irrigation ditch. It doubled their flow. It was a victory, not a final one, but a deep, fundamental one. They had found their own water. The next time Mrs. Griggs's wagon rumbled up the track. The atmosphere at Maddox Ridge was transformed. She found Cole and Rook reinforcing the new berm, their movements energetic. She found Sable in the kitchen, not just cooking, but poring over ledgers, a pencil tucked behind her ear. Well, glory be. Mrs. Griggs boomed, accepting a cup of coffee. Last time I was here, this place felt like a funeral. Now it feels like a fortress. What in blazes happened? We found water, Sable said, smiling. And we found a legal claim to it. Good, Mrs. Griggs said. Because you'll need it. Elias Lathrop is fit to be tied. He heard about your little digging expedition, and he's called a town meeting. He's bringing in a lawyer from Santa Fe. He's going to use his right of improvement claim to seize the dry willow for the good of the territory. He's going to steal it, legal-like, right in front of everyone. Sable nodded, her smile fading. She'd expected this. She pulled a piece of paper from the table. Then I need you to deliver this to every small rancher and homesteader between here and the fort. Can you? Mrs. Griggs read the note. The words were simple, clear, and powerful. Elias Lathrop is claiming the dry willow. Today, it's the Maddox Ditch. Tomorrow, it's your grazing rights. When one man controls all the water, every other man becomes his servant. Who touches the ditch, touches every cattleman's meal. The peddler woman let out a low whistle. Child, this ain't a flyer. This is a declaration of war. I'll have it in 50 hands by sundown. The town meeting was held in the biggest room in Mesita Bluff, the Silver Spur Saloon. It was packed. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, sweat, and tension. Sheriff Dawes, looking deeply uncomfortable, sat at a table at the front. Beside him sat Elias Lathrop, radiating smug confidence, and his slick, pinstripe-suited lawyer. Cole and Sable stood in the back. The small ranchers, the ones who had received Sable's flyer, watched from the sides, their faces grim. It's a matter of public good, the lawyer was saying, his voice smooth and practiced. My client, Mr. Lathrop, wishes only to improve the valley, to take this unmanaged resource, he waved a hand dismissively, and put it to productive, profitable use. He is exercising his legal right of improvement on fallow land.
That's a lie,
Cole's voice boomed from the back.
That's my land and my water.
Ah, Mr. Maddox. The lawyer smiled, turning. We were coming to you. You have no legal, registered charter for that ditch. It is, by territorial law, unrecorded and therefore public land, open to improvement. A low murmur of agreement came from the Lathrop supporters near the bar. Cole started to push through the crowd, his fists clenched. Sable put a firm hand on his arm. He stopped, looking down at her. I'll handle the honor. He'd told her, you handle the paper. He gave a curt nod. She held his gaze for a second, drawing strength from his new, solid trust in her. Then she stepped forward. The crowd parted. All eyes fell on this small, determined woman in the plain dress. That's not true, she said, her voice clear and carrying in the sudden silence. The lawyer's smile faltered. I beg your pardon, Miss Hart, Sable Hart, she said, and I'm Mr. Maddox's bookkeeper. She walked to the front table and laid the Padre's transcribed document down. You said the ditch was unrecorded. You're wrong. This is a certified copy of the parish registry, 1862. It describes the Maddox diversion ditch as the southern property line, witnessed by Territorial Marshal Miller. The name Miller caused a stir. He was a local legend, a man whose reputation was ironclad. Sable pressed her advantage, turning to the ranchers on the sides. Mr. Lathrop isn't improving anything. He's stealing. He's stealing the water that Maddox Ridge has used for 30 years. And as my notes said, she saw the spark of recognition in their eyes. When he's done stealing from Cole Maddox, he will start stealing from you. The mood in the saloon turned, fast and cold. The quiet, grim-faced ranchers began to move, surrounding the men from the bank. Elias Lathrop's face was purple with rage. Sheriff Dawes, seeing the sheer number of angry armed cattlemen, quickly slammed his gavel. This is a civil matter, he declared, his voice high. Not a town matter, I have no jurisdiction. Meeting adjourned. It was a rout. Lathrop and his lawyer had to push their way out of the saloon, followed by the cold, hostile stares of the entire room. Cole and Sable had won. As they stepped out onto the boardwalk, into the cool twilight, a man detached himself from the shadows of the alley. He was tall, broad, and wore a long, filthy duster. His face was a ruin of old scars, and he smiled at them, showing teeth stained black. Maddox, the man grunted. Cole instinctively pushed Sable half behind him. That was smart, the man said, his voice a wet rasp. He spat a stream of tobacco juice that landed inches from Sable's boot. Real smart, sending your little bookkeeper to do your talkin'. He looked Sable up and down, his eyes lingering in a way that made her skin crawl. I'm Bale Crow. Mr. Lathrop wants you to know, that paper won't stop a bullet, and it won't stop a fire. He laughed, a short, ugly sound, and melted back into the darkness. From his office window, Sheriff Dawes watched the entire exchange and did nothing. The ride back to the ranch was silent. The legal victory felt thin, brittle. The threat of Bale Crow was thick and real. The next day, Cole took her to the ridge, to the place under the cottonwood trees. He wasn't carrying his rifle. He was carrying a holstered .38 revolver. He handed it to her. The shotgun is for the yard, he said, his voice flat. This is for the house. This is for men like Crow. He showed her how to hold it, how to sight. His hands were gentle on hers, adjusting her grip. It's not about strength, he said, his voice low, his face close to hers. It's about breath. You don't fight the gun. You breathe. You aim. You squeeze. You don't pull. It was practical. It was trust. He was giving her the power to defend herself, to defend him. She fired, and the recoil was less than she expected. She hit the can he'd set on a rock. They sat for a long time after, the gun cooling on the ground between them. The ridge was quiet, the air peaceful. "I told you," Cole said, his voice so low she almost didn't hear it. "I told you Mary died of fever." Sable waited, her heart aching, knowing this was a different kind of confession. That wasn't the whole truth. He picked up a twig, breaking it into small pieces. She hated it here. She hated the silence, the wind. She begged me to leave, to take her to Santa Fe before the snows came. She was from back east. She wasn't made for this. He stared out at the valley. His valley. The land he loved. I told her no. I said the ranch came first. The herd. The work. It had to be done. I put the ranch before her. When she got sick, his voice broke. Just for a second. I wasn't just too late, Sable. I was wrong. I was proud. And my pride, it left her alone when she needed me. I chose this dirt over her. That's a guilt that he couldn't finish. Sable didn't offer him easy comfort. She didn't tell him he was wrong. She just reached over and took his large, calloused hand. It was the first time she had initiated the touch. "You couldn't have known," she said, her voice firm, pulling his gaze to hers. "But you're not alone now, and I'm not Mary. I'm not leaving just because the wind is turning. I'm staying. We are staying." He gripped her hand, a lifetime of solitary guilt finding its first release. Their moment was broken by the sound of a horse. Padre Esteban was riding hard up the track, his brown cassock flying. He looked alarmed. "Cole, Sable, you must be careful," he called out, reining in his mule. "You won the meeting, but you lost the war for Lathrop's pride." "Let him come," Cole said, standing, his hand still holding Sable's. "Crow doesn't scare us." "It's not Crow," the Padre said, his face grim. "Not yet. Lathrop is using a different weapon. He's poisoning the town. He's telling everyone that you Mija." He looked at Sable, his eyes full of pain. "That you are not a bookkeeper. That you are a saloon girl he hired from a dirty advertisement. That you are a woman of low morals." Sable felt the blood drain from her face. It was the one attack she had no defense against. The whispers she'd faced at the market. This was the fire to that smoke. "He's preparing one last move," the Padre said, speaking quickly. "He's going to send Crow to destroy your new berm, to flood your fields, and he's going to blame you. He'll tell Sheriff Dawes you're unstable, that you're a spiteful woman, that Cole is harboring a dangerous influence. He's going to destroy your name, Sable, so that no one will ever believe your paper again." Sable stood frozen, the old familiar shame washing over her. Cole stepped in front of her, shielding her from the Padre's words. He looked at her, his eyes blazing, not with anger at her, but with a pure, protective fury. He had made his choice. "Let them talk about honor," he said, his voice a low growl. "I'll handle the honor." He turned and looked at Sable, his trust absolute, his meaning clear. The Lathrops could send their thugs and their lies. He would be the shield. "You," he said, his voice softening just for her. "You just keep handling the paper." The night was a well of ink. There was no moon, no starlight, only a thick, oppressive blackness that swallowed the familiar shapes of the barn and the corral. A cold wind scraped across the prairie, carrying the scent of dust and the promise of a hard winter. At Maddox Ridge, they were waiting. The water buckets by the hayshed were full. The shotgun was loaded and leaning not on the wall, but against the leg of the kitchen table. The attack did not begin with a sound. It began with a sudden, silent flower of orange blooming against the black wall of the night. Sable saw it through the kitchen window, a torch arcing through the air in a fiery parabola, trailing sparks like angry fireflies. It landed with a soft, hungry whoomph in the pile of dry hay stacked against the shed. "Cole!" Her voice was a sharp, focused cry, devoid of panic. The dry hay ignited instantly. A crackling, roaring explosion of light and heat that painted the entire ranch in a flickering, hellish orange. Sable was already moving. She grabbed 2 heavy wool blankets from a chest blankets they had soaked in the water trough that evening. A grim preparation for a night just like this. She threw open the back door and ran, the cold, wet weight of the blankets slapping against her. The heat was a physical blow, pushing her back. She ignored it. With a heave, she flung the first wet blanket over the heart of the blaze. It hissed and smoked, a momentary check on the fire's rage. She threw the second, covering another section. It wasn't enough to kill it, but it was enough to slow it, to buy precious seconds. From the corner of her eye, she saw Cole and Rook burst from the bunkhouse. They weren't running toward the fire. They were running toward the corral, where the 4 steers and the mare, trapped in the sudden, terrifying light, were beginning to scream and crash against the rails.
Get 'em out!
Cole roared over the fire's crackle. Get 'em into the north pasture before they break their legs. The ranch exploded into 3 distinct points of frantic, desperate action. Sable, a lone figure battling the growing blaze. Cole and Rook, shadows against the flames, wrestling with the panicked gate, trying to save their livelihood from its own terror. And a 4th point of action, Bale Crow, a broad silhouette against the fire, strode not toward the house, not toward the barn, but straight for the irrigation ditch. In his hand was a heavy iron pry bar. He was laughing. He vaulted into the ditch and slammed the bar against the new berm, the earth Sable and Cole had so painstakingly built. A large chunk of the wall crumbled. Sable saw him. She saw the weak point in their defense, the strategic heart of the entire attack. The fire was a diversion. The real target was the water. She abandoned the blankets, her mind racing. The shotgun was too far. The revolver was in the house, but coiled on a peg just inside the barn door, where she had left it after mending the harness, was a long, heavy lariat. She snatched it. Her hands were sure, her mind cold and clear. She ran, not at Crow, but parallel to the ditch, using the shadows cast by the burning hay shed to mask her approach. Crow was working with a brute's efficiency, grunting as he tore down their wall. He didn't see her. He didn't hear her. Sable stopped 20 feet away. She swung the rope once, twice, building momentum. The loop a perfect, singing circle in the firelight. She let it fly. The lariat shot through the air, a living thing. It snapped taut around Bale Crow's right wrist, the one holding the pry bar. He let out a grunt of pure shock. The rope yanked his arm back, and a revolver he'd had tucked in his belt, now freed by the sudden movement, flew from its holster. It spun through the air, a dark, metallic arc, and landed with a soft plop in the muddy water of the ditch. Disarmed. Crow roared in fury and confusion, trying to yank his arm free, but Sable had already dug in her heels, pulling the rope tight, her smaller frame anchored by sheer, desperate leverage. A shape hurtled out of the darkness behind her. It wasn't Crow. It was another of his men, a wiry, rat-faced man she'd seen lounging with the Lathrops in town. He grabbed her from behind, one arm hooking around her throat, the other snatching the rope from her grasp.
"Get off me, you witch!"
he snarled, throwing her backward. Sable stumbled, her back hitting the rough, splintery wood of the corral fence with a jarring impact. The man raised a heavy glass bottle, its neck broken into a jagged weapon, the firelight glinting on the sharp edges. He lunged. She had no time to scream, no time to move. A blur of motion. Cole. He had seen. He had left Rook with the cattle and was running, his face a mask of pure, murderous rage. He didn't have time to stop the man's arm. He only had time to move his own body. He threw himself between Sable and her attacker. The jagged bottle, meant for her face, slashed across Cole's left shoulder. The sound was sickening, a wet, tearing sound. Cole grunted, a deep, guttural sound of pain. But he didn't go down. His momentum carried him forward, and his right fist, a hammer of bone and muscle, connected with the man's jaw. The crack of bone was louder than the breaking bottle. The rat-faced man crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Sable stared, frozen for a half-second, at the dark, spreading stain on Cole's shirt. Then the paralysis broke. She scrambled to her feet, snatching up a fallen piece of fence post. 2 more of Crow's men were closing in, emboldened by Cole's injury.
Get back!
She screamed, her voice raw. From the house, the 10-gauge shotgun boomed, a deafening blast that shook the night. Rook, having herded the last of the cattle to safety, had made it back. He fired the second barrel into the air. The warning shots, and the sight of Cole turning on them, his face demonic in the firelight despite his wound, was enough. The 2 thugs hesitated, then broke and ran, melting into the darkness. Just then, another sound cut through the chaos, the clatter of a fast-approaching wagon. Hold it right there in the name of the law. Sheriff Dawes. He pulled his wagon to a halt, his single deputy beside him, both holding rifles. But he didn't position the wagon to block the fleeing thugs, or bail Crow, who was now scrambling out of the ditch. He positioned it squarely between Maddox Ridge and the main track, blocking the way out. He was a gatekeeper, not a lawman.
All right, that's enough,
Dawes shouted, his voice carrying a false authority.
Everyone just stand down.
But another sound was beginning to build, a sound that made Dawes's face pale in the firelight. Bong! 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 It was the deep, resonant toll of the mission bell. Padre Esteban, warned by Mrs. Griggs, had been watching. The sound rolled across the valley, a solemn, urgent summons. Within minutes, they started to arrive. First a lone rider, then a buckboard filled with sleepy, confused ranchers, then another. They came with lanterns and rifles, drawn by the fire and the bell. The entire community was waking up. They stopped at the edge of the ranch, their lanterns creating a ring of bobbing, yellow lights, and they saw. They saw the burning hay. They saw Bail Crow, covered in mud, standing over the ruined berm. They saw the unconscious man on the ground. They saw Sable, her face smudged with soot, clutching a fence post. And they saw Cole Maddox, standing protectively in front of her, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side, his shirt soaked in blood. Most damning of all, in the combined light of the fire and their own lanterns, they saw the line of wooden stakes leading from the ditch, and on the top of each one, a daub of bright, unmistakable, Lathrop red paint. The whispers started, a low, angry hum that spread through the crowd. This wasn't a trespass. This was an invasion. Bail Crow saw the tide turn. He saw the cold, hard faces of the ranchers. He saw the evidence of his employer's greed laid bare for all to see. Panic seized him.
It wasn't me,
he shouted, his voice high with fear. Lathrop, he sent us. He'll pay you. He'll pay all of you. He turned and ran, scrambling up the far bank of the gully. Sable was not going to let him escape. Adrenaline surged through her, a white-hot wave of pure, righteous fury. She dropped the fence post and snatched up a heavy wooden mallet Rook used for driving fence posts. She ran, her feet flying over the rough ground, and cornered Crow at the edge of the ditch. "You're not leaving," she said, her voice deadly quiet. She held the mallet up. It was not a threat to kill. It was a promise to stop. Crow, seeing the absolute, unbending resolve in her eyes, froze. Cole was right behind her. He came to a stop at her shoulder, his good arm held out slightly, a solid, living shield at her back. His blood dripped softly onto the thirsty red dirt. And then the sky broke. A cold, seasonal rain, the one the wind had been promising all night, began to fall. It came down in a sudden, hissing sheet, dousing the last of the burning hay, turning the dust to instant mud. It slicked the rocks and soaked the men. The torches held by Crow's few remaining thugs sputtered and died. The retreat was a chaotic, humiliating scramble in the dark and the mud. The ranchers, their faces grim. Let them go, their silence more menacing than any threat. Sheriff Dawes, seeing his authority utterly dissolved, his complicity exposed, could only sit in his wagon, watching as the evidence of his failure was washed away by the rain. The night fell quiet again. The only sounds, the steady drumming of the rain and the low, angry murmuring of the assembled townspeople. The adrenaline that had held Sable together, that had made her a fighter, a defender, a warrior, suddenly crashed. A violent, bone-jarring tremor seized her. Her teeth chattered. The heavy mallet slipped from her numb fingers and fell into the mud. A warm, solid hand settled on her shoulder. "Cole!" He stood beside her, his face pale with pain, but his eyes were fixed on her. He gently turned her away from the ditch, away from the watching eyes of the town, and pulled her into the shelter of his good side. "You're safe," he murmured, his voice a low, rough whisper right by her ear, his warm breath a stark contrast to the cold rain. "Sable, you're safe." The kitchen was an island of lamplight in a sea of rain and murmuring voices. Outside, the ranchers Rook had roused formed a protective, silent cordon, their presence a low hum of support that kept the chaos of the night at bay. Inside, the world had shrunk to the space between the hearth and the heavy wooden table. The sharp, metallic scent of blood mingled with the acrid smell of gunpowder that clung to Sable's dress and the clean, stinging odor of whiskey. She had torn a strip from the cleanest linen sheet she owned and was carefully, painstakingly, cleaning the gash on Cole's shoulder. He sat shirtless in a chair, his good hand gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles were white mountains on a plane of weathered skin. He didn't flinch, he didn't make a sound, but his jaw was set like granite, and a fine sheen of sweat beaded on his forehead. His eyes, dark with pain and a fierce, unreadable emotion, never left her face. He watched every movement of her hands, every flicker of concern in her expression, as if she were the only thing holding the world together. The wound was ugly, a long, deep slice from the broken bottle, bleeding sluggishly now that the initial torrent had passed. It would need stitches, and she had the needle and fishing line ready, boiled clean in a pot on the stove. "Hold still," she murmured, her voice tight and low. She poured a little of the whiskey directly into the cut. His whole body went rigid. A low, ragged hiss of breath escaped his clenched teeth. The muscles in his back and arms corded into knots of pure, controlled agony, but he didn't move. She looked at the raw, brutal evidence of his sacrifice, the flesh torn open where she should have been. A wave of something hot and furious and terrifyingly tender washed over her. The adrenaline from the fight was gone, replaced by a trembling, aching aftermath. "You stubborn fool," she whispered, her voice catching, thick with unshed tears. She wasn't looking at the wound anymore. She was looking at him, at the hard, proud set of his face. "You absolute stubborn, bull-headed fool. You could have been killed." He let out his breath in a slow, controlled stream. He finally relaxed his death grip on the table. He didn't answer her accusation. He just stated a fact, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "I chose to let it be me," he said, his gaze locking with hers. "Not you." The simple, unadorned truth of it broke something inside her. It wasn't a boast. It wasn't a claim for gratitude. It was a statement of his choice, a declaration of her worth in the face of violence. He had put himself in the path of the blow without a second's thought. The tears she'd been fighting finally spilled over, tracking clean paths through the soot on her cheeks. She quickly wiped them away with the back of her hand, angry at their betrayal. This was no time for weeping. She had work to do. She threaded the needle. "This is going to hurt," she said, her voice more composed. "It already does," he replied, his eyes still holding hers. She worked in silence, her hands surprisingly steady. Her stitches were small and neat, the work of a mender. A woman used to putting broken things back together. He sat utterly still under her hands, his breathing the only sign of the pain he was enduring. When she was done, she tied off the last stitch and covered her work with a clean pad of linen. The intimacy of the act was overwhelming. Her hands were on his bare skin, his warmth radiating into her palms. The smell of his skin, of soap and sweat and the rain, filled her senses. She finally allowed herself to meet his gaze again. The question that had haunted her from the moment he had touched her by the fire, the fear that had been a cold stone in her heart, finally found its voice. "I was afraid," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She pulled her hands back, busying herself with putting the needle away, unable to look at him as she spoke. "When I first came here, and after, I was afraid that you saw her." She couldn't say Mary's name. "I was afraid I was just a shape in the dark for you to put a ghost's face on. That I was a replacement, someone to fill the quiet." She turned back, forcing herself to face him, to lay her deepest fear bare. "But tonight, when I saw that torch, when I ran out here and threw those blankets on the fire," she took a shaky breath. "It wasn't your hay I was saving. It wasn't Maddox Ridge I was defending." Her voice grew stronger, imbued with a shocking, dawning certainty. "It was my home. When I stood in that ditch, with that rope in my hand, I was protecting my home." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and true. It was the deepest part of her, the secret she hadn't even known she was keeping. Cole listened, his expression unreadable. The pain of the wound seemed to have vanished, replaced by an intense, consuming focus on her words. He reached out with his good hand, not to touch her, but to gently cup her chin, tilting her face up so she could not look away. His thumb stroked her skin, a gesture of profound tenderness. "I don't need a shadow. Sable," he said, his voice deep and absolute, cutting through all her fear and doubt. "I don't need a ghost." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze holding her captive, pinning her soul with its raw honesty. "I need Sable. The name, her name, spoken not as a label but as an identity, a necessity. He didn't see a replacement. He saw her." A choked, ragged sob escaped her lips. It was a sound of release, of a burden she hadn't realized she was carrying finally being lifted. The tears came again, but this time they were not tears of fear or anger. They were tears of a deep, soul-shattering relief. She laughed, a wet, broken sound, and threw her arms around his neck, careful of his injured shoulder. He brought his good arm around her, holding her tight against his chest. He buried his face in her hair, which smelled of rain and wood smoke. They held each other for a long, silent moment, a desperate, clinging embrace that was a vow, a treaty, a surrender. The fight with Bale Crow was over. This was the true aftermath, the rebuilding of two broken souls in the quiet of a lamplit kitchen. The back door burst open with a crash, shattering the moment. A gust of wet, cold wind swept into the room, making the lamp flame dance wildly. Mrs. Griggs stood there, her face set in a grim, determined scowl, a rifle held in the crook of her arm. Behind her were Padre Esteban, his brown cassock soaked and muddy, and Rook, his face streaked with rain. "Sorry to intrude." "Mrs." Griggs boomed, her voice leaving no room for argument. "But the people are restless, and I'm not one to let a fire go cold." They stepped inside, bringing the energy of the outside world with them. They saw Cole, shirtless and bandaged. They saw Sable, her face tear-streaked but her eyes clear and strong, her arms still loosely around his neck. They saw the scene not as one of impropriety, but as one of alliance. "The men outside," Rook said, nodding toward the door. "They're waiting. They want to ride to the Lathrop Ranch right now. They're talking about a rope." "There will be no ropes," Padre Esteban said, his voice quiet but firm, carrying the authority of his office. "We will not become the thing we are fighting. We will have justice, but it will be our justice, the law of the community, not the law of the mob." He stepped forward and laid a piece of paper on the table, next to the bloody rags and the whiskey bottle. It was a formal petition, his elegant script filling the page. "It demands the immediate resignation of Sheriff Dawes for dereliction of duty and complicity," the padre announced. "And it demands that the territorial marshal convene a grand jury to investigate the Lathrop banking house for conspiracy, property damage, and incitement to violence." He placed a bottle of ink and a pen beside it. "It needs a first signature, the signature of the aggrieved party." All eyes turned to Sable. It was her name Lathrop had tried to destroy. It was her person they had attacked. She gently pulled away from Cole. She walked to the table, dipped the pen in the ink, and in a clear, steady hand, she wrote her name at the top of the page. Sable Hart. She paused, the pen hovering over the paper. Then, she moved to sign her last name. A large, warm hand covered hers. Cole. He had come to stand beside her. He didn't say a word. He just placed his hand over her own, his fingers gently guiding hers. He wasn't forcing her. He wasn't commanding. He was inviting. Under the steady pressure of his hand, she finished her signature. But it wasn't the name she had started to write. The ink flowed onto the page, dark and permanent. Sable Maddox. A stunned silence fell over the room. Rook's jaw dropped. Mrs. Griggs's stern face broke into a wide, triumphant grin. Cole removed his hand. He looked at the signature, then at her. A slow, gentle smile, the one she had seen only once before, touched his lips. It was an offer of a future, a shared name, a shared life, made in front of their entire world. Padre Esteban cleared his throat, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "Well," he said, his voice full of a gentle, profound satisfaction, "I believe that settles the matter." He herded Mrs. Griggs and Rook toward the door. "Let us take this to the people," he said, picking up the petition. "These two, I believe they have earned a moment of peace." He closed the door softly behind them, leaving Sable and Cole alone once more in the warm, golden light of the kitchen. The sound of the crowd outside faded, replaced by the soft whisper of the dying rain on the roof. The tension, the fear, the violence of the night had finally, truly, receded. A deep, quiet peace settled in its place. Sable looked at the name on the paper. Her name. Their name. She looked at him, at his tired, battered, beautiful face. She stepped into the circle of his good arm and laid her forehead gently in the hollow of his shoulder. She closed her eyes, breathing in his scent, feeling the slow, steady beat of his heart. Outside, the rain stopped. Inside, their breathing slowed, falling into the quiet, peaceful rhythm of home. The town meeting was not a trial. A trial implied a neutral arbiter, a system of established law. This was something older, something more fundamental. It was a reckoning. They gathered 2 days after the attack, not in the saloon this time, but in the open space in front of the livery stable, under a vast, indifferent blue sky. The entire population of Coyote Ford and the surrounding ranches was there. They stood in clusters, not as a single crowd. On one side, near the bank's doors, were the Lathrops, Elias, his 2 sons Jeb and Wiley, and a small, nervous contingent of merchants and clerks who depended on their credit. They were dressed in their Sunday best, an absurd display of propriety in the face of their crimes. On the other side, filling the rest of the square, were the ranchers, the homesteaders, the blacksmith, Mrs. Griggs, Padre Esteban, and Rook. They were not dressed for church. They were dressed for work, their faces hard and weathered, their hands resting not on hymn books, but on the worn leather of their belts. In the center of this human divide stood a wagon. On it sat the new, temporary authority of the town deputy Lane, a young, earnest man who looked terrified but resolute. Beside him, in a makeshift cell built of ropes and horse tack in the back of a freight wagon, sat Bale Crow, his face a sullen mask of bruises. Cole and Sable stood at the front of the ranchers' group. Cole's left arm was in a clean linen sling, a stark white slash against his dark shirt. He was a living, breathing piece of evidence. Sable stood beside him, not behind him. She held a satchel containing her maps and the Padre's document. She felt the eyes of the town on her, but for the first time, she felt no shame. She met their stares with a calm, level gaze. She was not the kept woman. She was the bookkeeper of Maddox Ridge, and she was here to present her accounts. Deputy Lane cleared his throat, his voice cracking slightly before it found its strength. "We're here because a crime was committed," he began, his voice carrying in the cold, still air. "An attack on a man's home, on his livelihood. Mr. Lathrop has requested a chance to speak. The people have requested a chance to answer." Elias Lathrop stepped forward, his face a mask of aggrieved innocence. He didn't bring his lawyer this time. This was a court of public opinion, and he knew a slick-suited man from Santa Fe would only hurt his case. "My friends, my neighbors," he began, his voice oozing a false sincerity. "There has been a terrible misunderstanding, a tragedy. My employee, Mr. Crow," he gestured dismissively toward the wagon, "acted without my knowledge or consent. He is a violent man, and I have dismissed him. This dispute over a patch of dirt and a trickle of water has gotten out of hand. It is a simple property disagreement, nothing more." A low, dangerous rumble went through the crowd of ranchers. "That's a lie," a voice called out. It was a homesteader named Jensen, a man whose small herd relied on the runoff from the dry willow. "We saw the stakes, Lathrop. We saw your red paint." "Surveyor's stakes," Lathrop countered smoothly. "Part of a legitimate legal process to assess land for improvement." Sable stepped forward. The crowd fell silent. "It wasn't a surveyor who came in the night. Mr. Lathrop," she said, her voice clear and ringing. "It was an arsonist. It wasn't a property disagreement that left Mr. Maddox with a wound that could have killed him." She walked to the wagon where Lane sat and opened her satchel. She didn't produce the legal document first. She unrolled her hand-drawn map, the one she had sketched in the dusk, showing the arrogant red line of his stakes cutting across the Maddox property. She held it up for everyone to see. "This is not a survey," she declared. "This is a theft." Next, she produced the Padre's document. "And this," she said, handing it to Lane, "is a copy of the mission record from 1862 signed by Marshall Miller himself, establishing the Maddox family's legal claim to that ditch for nearly 30 years. This is not a disagreement. This is history." Finally, she reached into the satchel and pulled out one of the actual stakes, its top still smeared with the garish red paint. She held it up high. The sun glinted off its freshly cut wood. It was a tangible piece of the crime, undeniable and stark. "And this," she said, her voice dropping, filled with a cold, hard anger, "is not improvement. This is a threat." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The evidence was overwhelming. A three-pronged attack of logic, history, and physical proof. But it was Mrs. Griggs who delivered the final, fatal blow. She pushed her way to the front, her face a thundercloud of righteous indignation. "You want to talk about misunderstandings, Elias Lathrop," she boomed, her powerful voice silencing all others. "Let's talk about the misunderstanding you posted in a Kansas stagecoach office, the one that brought this young woman all the way out here on a lie." A wave of shock and renewed anger went through the townspeople. Many had heard the whispers, but hearing it stated so plainly, so publicly, was different. "You didn't just try to steal his water, Mrs. Griggs thundered, pointing a thick finger at Lathrop. "You tried to steal his honor. You tried to shame him. You used this woman's hope as a weapon to humiliate a grieving man. That ain't a property dispute. That is the work of a coward and a snake." The accusation landed with the force of a physical blow. In the harsh, unwritten code of the frontier, a man's honor was as valuable as his land. Lathrop had not just broken the law, he had broken the code. He had played dirty. Elias Lathrop's face, which had been a mask of control, finally crumbled. A dull, plethoric red crept up from his starched collar. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was finished. His sons, Jeb and Wiley, stared at the ground, their usual arrogance replaced by the dull shame of public exposure. The reckoning was swift. Padre Esteban stepped forward, holding the petition, now heavy with the signatures of nearly every homesteader in the valley. He handed it to Deputy Lane. "The people have lost their faith in Sheriff Dawes," he said simply. "They request his immediate removal." Dawes, who had been trying to make himself invisible near the back of the crowd, turned and walked away. Not toward his office, but toward his house. His career in Coyote Ford was over. "I'll accept the post," Lane said, his voice now steady and strong. "And my first act as acting sheriff is this." He turned to the makeshift cell. "Bail Crow, you are under arrest for willful destruction of property, arson, and assault with intent to do grave harm. You'll be held for the circuit judge." Crow just spat into the dust. Finally, Lane turned to Lathrop. "Mr. Lathrop, there is the matter of damages." Cole spoke for the first time, his voice a low, rumbling command. "He will pay for a new hayshed. He will pay for the lost feed, and he will pay to have every one of his red stakes pulled from my land. Today." Lathrop, defeated and surrounded, could only nod his curt, humiliated agreement. It was Padre Esteban who sealed the new order. "The dry willow is the lifeblood of this valley," he announced to the assembled crowd. "It is too precious to be the subject of feuds. It belongs to all of us." He held up his hands. "We are forming a new body, the Dry Willow Water Association. Every rancher who relies on this water will have a vote. We will manage it together, as a community, to ensure it is shared fairly and protected from greed." A murmur of assent, of profound relief, went through the ranchers. It was a brilliant solution, turning a point of contention into a bond of community. "The association will need managers," the Padre continued, a small smile playing on his lips. "Someone who understands the land, and someone who understands the paper." He looked directly at the center of the crowd. "I nominate Cole Maddox and Sable Maddox to serve as its first co-chairs." The use of her new, publicly claimed name sent a quiet shock through the crowd, followed by a slow, spreading wave of approval. It was a confirmation of the new reality. This wasn't just Cole's victory, it was theirs. A low rumble of ayes sealed the vote. The Lathrops, utterly defeated, turned and retreated into the sanctuary of their bank, the crowd parting for them in a cold, contemptuous silence. The silence that settled over Coyote Ford was different now. It was not the silence of fear or tension. It was the heavy, satisfying silence of respect. Justice, frontier style, had been served. As the crowd began to disperse, the men patting Cole's good shoulder, the women nodding to Sable with newfound admiration, Cole took her hand. He gently pulled her away from the last of the well-wishers, leading her across the dusty square, away from the scene of their public triumph, to the quiet shade of a lone cottonwood tree near the mission wall. The noise of the town faded behind them. Here, there was only the soft rustle of the dry leaves above them and the warmth of the autumn sun. He turned to face her, his hand still holding hers. His face was tired, etched with the pain of his wound and the exhaustion of the long fight. But his eyes were clearer than she had ever seen them, free of the shadows of grief and anger. He looked at their joined hands, then into her eyes. "The petition is signed," he said, his voice low and soft. "The fight is over." He took a breath. the vulnerability in his gaze making her heart ache. "You are free now, Sable. Free to go wherever you want. Free to find a place that hasn't been so full of trouble." He paused, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "But if you want to—" He hesitated, the man of few words searching for the most important ones of his life. Stay with me." It wasn't a demand. It wasn't an assumption. It was a question, offered with a raw, humble hope that stole her breath. Sable looked away from the intensity of his gaze, up toward the high ridge that overlooked the town, the same ridge where he had taught her to shoot, the same ridge where Mary was buried. A long, thin wisp of a white cloud drifted lazily across the deep blue of the sky. She thought of her arrival, a lone, desperate woman clutching a false promise. She thought of all the nights she had lain awake, dreaming of a freedom she could never quite define. She had been looking for a place. She had found a person. She turned back to him, a slow, radiant smile spreading across her face. She didn't need to say a word. Her answer was in her eyes, in the way her fingers tightened around his. She brought his hand to her lips and pressed a soft kiss to his calloused knuckles. Then she looked at him, her smile full of a deep, unshakable peace. "I'll stay home," she said. A look of such profound, staggering relief washed over his face that it made her own heart swell. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for years. A loud, cheerful wolf whistle cut through the quiet moment. They both turned. Rook was leaning against the mission wall a short distance away, a wide, gap-toothed grin on his face. He tipped his hat to them. Cole laughed, a real deep, unburdened laugh that Sable had never heard before. She found herself laughing with him, a bright, joyous sound that felt as new and clean as the world after a storm. The weight of the past weeks, the fear and the violence and the uncertainty, finally lifted. It floated away on the autumn breeze, leaving behind a profound sense of lightness, of peace. A quiet, durable joy settled into the very timbers of Maddox Ridge, a place that had finally, truly, become a home. Winter returned to Coyote Ford not with the brutal, sudden violence of a blizzard, but with the gentle, persistent whisper of a first snow. It came in the late afternoon, a fine, dry powder that drifted from a sky the color of a faded blue-gray work shirt. It clung to the bare branches of the cottonwoods, softened the hard edges of the corral fence, and laid a pristine, sound-dampening blanket over the yard. The only color in the landscape was the warm, golden light spilling from the windows of the ranch house, and the soft, steady plume of juniper smoke rising from the chimney, a gray brushstroke against the muted sky. Inside, the house was a haven of warmth and quiet industry. The air was rich with the scent of baking bread, drying herbs, and the faint, pleasant aroma of pine from the fire. Against the far wall, where a bare patch of adobe had once been, stood a small, sturdy bookshelf. Sable had built it herself from leftover planks, her hands now as skilled with a hammer and saw as they were with a needle or a spoon. The shelves were not filled with the leather-bound volumes from back east. They were filled with scraps of paper, cheap notebooks, and even smoothed-out pieces of wrapping paper, all covered in her careful, improving script. They were stories of brave horses, cunning coyotes, and the time the mission bell had saved a ranch. Twice a week, the children from the neighboring homesteads would trudge over, their faces bright with anticipation, and sit cross-legged on the floor by the fire while Sable read to them, their peals of laughter a new and welcome music within the old walls. Cole had taken to the sound, and to sound itself. The deep, ingrained silence of his grief had begun to thaw, giving way to words. He was not a man for chatter, and never would be. His sentences were still built like a well-made fence, sturdy, economical, and without unnecessary flourish. But they were there. He would describe the track of a mountain lion he'd found by the creek, or tell a dryly funny story about Rook's stubborn mule. His words were still rough-hewn, but they were warm to the touch. Sable would listen, her head tilted, her hands busy with her mending or her writing. She listened to him the way the fire listened to the wind drawing him out, her quiet attention making his own voice stronger, warmer. She learned the landscape of his thoughts as surely as she had learned the landscape of the ranch. That afternoon, she needed to bring in another armload of firewood from the sheltered stack on the porch. The cold was deepening as the sun set. She paused by the door and, on instinct, reached for the heavy canvas duck-cloth coat hanging on the peg. His coat, the one he had thrown over her shoulders on the day she arrived, a lifetime ago. It had become a shared thing, worn by whichever of them was facing the worst of the wind. She slipped it on, the familiar weight a comfort, the worn wool lining still holding a faint trace of his warmth. As she slid her hand into the deep pocket, her fingers brushed against a piece of folded paper that wasn't hers. Curious, she pulled it out. It was a clean scrap, torn from one of her writing notebooks. The handwriting was his, the letters big and slightly clumsy, but formed with a fierce intent. There were only 7 words. "That day, my heart chose you." She stared at the note, the wind forgotten, the cold unnoticed. There was no date, but she knew. That day, the day of the storm, the day of the attack, the day she had stood her ground. Her heart, which had been so steady and calm, gave a painful, joyous lurch. This silent, steadfast man, who had shown his heart in 1,000 actions, had finally found the words. She carefully folded the note and tucked it deep into the pocket of her own dress. A secret, precious warmth against her skin. They ate their dinner that night not at the table, but on a thick bearskin rug spread before the hearth, the way they often did when the nights were coldest. The meal was simple, a testament to their new, comfortable life. There were hot corn cakes, glistening with melted butter and a drizzle of dark molasses, and a simmering pot of beans with salt pork. It was a meal of substance and peace. The only sounds the soft hiss and pop of the logs in the fire, and the gentle, rhythmic whisper of snow falling against the window panes. Cole sat leaning against a rolled-up blanket, his long legs stretched out toward the flames. His injured shoulder had healed into a puckered, silver scar, a permanent reminder of the price of their peace. Sable sat beside him, her back resting against his side, her head on his good shoulder. The silence between them was easy, a shared language of contentment. When they had finished eating, he took her empty plate and set it aside with his own. He didn't speak, he just shifted, turning toward her, his large frame creating a warm enclave that blocked out the rest of the world. He cupped her face in his hands, his palms warm and calloused against her skin. His gaze was soft in the firelight, full of a deep, quiet reverence. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was a slow, lingering kiss, full of the day's shared work and the night's shared peace. It was a kiss that held no questions and needed no answers. When he drew back, his hand slid from her face, down her neck, and came to rest on the small of her back, over the thick, soft wool of her sweater. He held her there for a moment, his fingers gently tracing the line of her spine. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, his hand slid lower, spreading over the gentle curve of her hip. The touch was firm, possessive, yet infinitely tender. Even through the layers of cloth, his warmth seemed to sink right through to her skin. Sable's breath caught. She tilted her head back, her eyes fluttering shut, and a soft, low sound, a murmur of pure contentment, vibrated in her throat as he applied a gentle pressure, pulling her more snugly against the hard length of his body. She was home. She was safe. She was wanted. She opened her eyes and looked into his. She brought her hand up to his cheek, her thumb stroking the rough, evening stubble along his jaw. "Don't let go," she whispered, the words a raw, heartfelt plea, a prayer against all the lonely nights of her past. He leaned his forehead against hers, his gaze steady and true, a silent promise in the firelight. "Never," he answered, his voice a low, solemn vow. The fire cast their mingled shadows, a single, unified shape, dancing on the rough-hewn walls. He was the rock, and she was the flame, and together they had created a warmth that could hold back any winter. He eased them down onto the soft rug, so they were lying on their sides, face to face. The firelight played over their features, softening the hard lines of his face, illuminating the peaceful glow in hers. He tucked a stray strand of her hair behind her ear, his touch lingering. Her hand rested on his chest, feeling the slow, steady drumbeat of his heart. Their foreheads touched, their legs tangled together under a shared blanket. A slow smile spread across his face, a smile of pure, unadulterated happiness. It was mirrored on her own. Outside, the wind picked up, moaning softly around the eaves of the house, carrying the scent of snow and cold. Dry earth. The world was vast and wild and indifferent. But inside, in the warm, flickering light, Maddox Ridge had ceased to exist. In their hearts, in the quiet, unspoken truth that flowed between them. It had been renamed. This was Home Ridge now. The fire crackled, spitting a last cheerful spark onto the hearth. Sable shifted, settling her head onto Cole's chest. Her ear pressed against the steady, reassuring rhythm of his heart. She closed her eyes, a deep, profound peace settling into her very bones. It was a peace they had not found, but forged, a peace they had fought for, bled for, and won for themselves, a peace as solid, as durable, and as timeless as the stones of the ridge itself. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please let us know in the comments below to connect and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. You can also show your extra support by hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.